Hello! Welcome back! Now, elephant in the room, I've been complaining about my roots for months, for those of you who are not new here, and I finally decided to fix it by just dyeing the rest of my hair to match my roots. I'm sure my stylist is going to be super pissed at me, but at least I don't have like 4 inches of black roots with bleach blonde hair anymore. So, the real reason you're here today is my 1950s TBR. Now, World War II is over. It's been over for about half a decade, but communism versus capitalism is still the overwhelming subject of the 1950s. In the US, communism bad, capitalism good. There are a lot of conflicts happening across the globe during the 1950s. The major ones, just for a quick review, we had the Korean War, which was Korea versus North Korea, or South Korea versus North Korea, a civil war. You have the Cold War, which is really the United States versus the Soviet Union. And it was a very interesting type of war because both countries had nukes, nuclear weapons, and it was mostly just spies posturing, threatening, but neither country really doing anything to attack the other one because of the fear of retaliation. During this time of conflict between the US and Soviet Union, US and Soviet Union were also battling for the space race, being the first country to outer space and then the first country to the moon and all of that kind of stuff. So that was happening in the 1950s, a lot of space exploration. The Vietnam War also happened during this period of time, which the US lost, but we still lie to ourselves about it. And there's a lot more. Those are just kind of like the highlights, which really they're lowlights because war sucks. In Europe, there is a lot of decolonization of former European colonies. You see this in Africa, South America, Asia, and then places like Greenland and Iceland. The USA was the most influential power during the 1950s on a global scale. We like to think we still are, but no. Sorry. The 1950s is basically where the Make America Great Again puts its goal towards, even though the 1950s were very problematic if you weren't a wealthy white man. The 1950s is the decade of the boomers. This is where the boomer mentality comes from. The generation before the 1950s was the greatest generation, and they suffered through World War I, the Great Depression, and early part of World War II. And the baby boom of the 1950s and the wealth and privilege of the middle class during this decade is where the entitlement of the boomer generation comes from. These people grew up where school was something you did and it didn't cost you a lot of money. You could pay for college going to your summer job. Inflation is not what it is today, and they didn't suffer like their parents did, and they're not dealing, and they didn't have to deal with the trash economy that they left their children. And this isn't overall. Obviously, there are some people born in this generation that aren't conceited assholes. It's a stereotype. The 1950s saw a whole hell of a lot as far as literary themes go. Religion was a really big theme in the 1950s. 69% of US households were Christian and attended church. This is like way higher than it has been in a long, long time, and it's going to just go down from there. Loneliness is another theme, specifically loneliness in a corporate society. Being just another cog in a big machine of capitalism, it's very lonely. There's no real sense of individualism any longer. Science fiction is also still really big. I read a whole lot of science fiction in the 1940s, but the science fiction trend is still continuing, especially with the whole space race thing going on. The thought of there being other planets with the potential for other species, like, are we alone in the universe, is a question that a lot of authors are asking. And then towards the later part of the decade, you see the beat movement, which the easiest way I can describe the beat movement is like what modern day hipsters are striving to be. It's anti-establishment, screw the man type of movement that you're going to see going more into the 1960s, but it did start in the 1950s. Now, I'm going to go through my 10 books for the 1950s, and I'm going to try to make this pretty quick. We'll see how well I could do. Just a short little hint of what I am reading. For 1951, I am reading The Catcher in the Rye by JD Salinger, and this is about teenage angst and rebellion. Still fits for today. There's a lot of teen angst. 1952, I am reading Charlotte's Web by E.B. White, and this is about a pig and a spider who are best friends, and how humanity is really fucking stupid, where they think that a pig is special because a spider writes quotes about the pig in its spider web, and they don't realize that, hey, there's a fucking spider who could speak and write in English. 1953, we're going dark, and reading Fahrenheit 451. This is about futuristic firefighters who start fires instead of putting them out, specifically burn books, because the government doesn't want you reading anymore. 1954, we're staying dark, and I am reading Lord of the Flies by William Golding. This is about the start of a new world war, and a group of adolescent boys are in a plane, and the plane crashes on an island. And it's the very darkest side of humanity, and kind of like the collapse of society. All I know is it's dark and super, super depressing and fucked up, so. Next up for 1955, apparently I am staying dark and reading Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. And an old man falls in love with a 12-year-old girl, and she wants nothing to fucking do with him, and holy shit, that's creepy. 1956, I am reading Night by Elie Wiesel. If you watched my Make Your Myth Taker TBR, one of the prompts for Make Your Myth Taker is to go into a book blind, and this was the only book on my TBR for 1950s that I didn't know what it was about, like, at all going into it. I just randomly picked a very popular award-winning book from 1956. Now, as I'm recording this, it's June 1st, so I've already read this book, and holy shit, was that the worst book to pick as a book to go into blind. Not only is this an award-winning piece of literature from 1956, it is also a nonfiction account of the fucking Holocaust, which I did not need to read first thing in the morning, having no idea what I was getting into. I was not emotionally prepared for that at all. So, bad choice on my part, but y'all can laugh at me for doing that to myself now. 1957. I'm reading all dark books this month. And I just now realized this. 1957, I am reading Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak. It's a very pretty cover, isn't it? This is a book about the Russian Revolution and its aftermath. 1958. We're getting a little bit lighter here. I'm reading Breakfast at Tiffany's by Truman Capote. This is a short story that was turned into a very, very famous movie with Audrey Hepburn. Everybody's heard of the movie, but did you know it was a short story before it was a movie? This is about a young, innocent girl who is caught up in the world of Playboy millionaires and gangsters, but like 1950s Italian gangsters, not like the modern day equivalent. 1959. I'm reading The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson because I only want to read depressing stuff this month, apparently. This is a closed circle horror story where a group of people spend the night in a haunted house and bad shit happens, because that's what happens in haunted house stories. And finally, for 1960, we're staying dark, and I'm reading To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. This is racism, just blatant fucking systematic racism from a child's perspective. A black man is accused of a crime he didn't commit, and the narrator, who is a young girl, her father is the lawyer who is trying to get this man acquitted of charges. And that's the 1950s. So contrary to stereotypes that everything was perfect and wonderful in the 1950s, I'm going to be reading nothing but dark, depressing books. I didn't plan this. I realized this literally as I'm recording it. So we're going to add in a bunch of other books outside of this decade in between these reads, so I'm not just constantly depressed. And I'm not going to be reading these in order, as I have already read my book for 1956. Let me know what you think about these books down in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video.